I'm going to turn.
Okay, so evening, everybody. Happy Hanukkah. And so as I said in my email to you all, I didn't want to just cancel class, but I didn't know how many people would be here. And back in the before times, we would occasionally have asked the rabbi for a Kiddush conversation, and they were fun. So I thought we would do that again. So I literally have like nothing on my mind. So I'll come up with them. But so if anybody has any asks, yes, Sue, you go first.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this for a while. So the way I understand it, after the temple was destroyed, there already were synagogues in existence.
That is correct.
And the rabbis decided, that would be kind of the way we would go. We couldn't have sacrifices. And then it seemed like the general feeling of most of the Jews at the time were that probably it would not be reinstated, or maybe that came a little later. But I guess what I'm wondering about is how that was handled during the first temple period. When that temple was destroyed, did they have synagogues? Or I know that the Haftorah portions were created if they couldn't read the Torah, but right. What did they do as far as worship? And were they more focused on rebuilding than the Jews were after the second temple?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, apparently, and it is hard to know, for sure. But the general consensus is that the institution of the synagogue was in Babylonia during the Babylonian exile. Although there was a similar institution even in Israel, because there were way more Kohanim than could reasonably serve in the temple. So Kohanim had like 2-week shifts, and then they would go back home to wherever their hometown was, and they would have in the hometown what was known as a ma'amad, which is like, I don't know how to translate that exactly, but they would have a ma'amad in their hometown at the same time that sacrifices were taking place in the temple. So, and then when Cyrus the Great allowed them to go back to Israel, but most of them didn't. I mean, we know about the Babylonian Talmud, for example, right? But what people may not realize is that the Jewish community in Babylonia, which is today more or less Iraq, it's not that they all went home and then they got exiled and wound up back in Babylonia. They stayed in Babylonia. And so the Iraqi Jews, I mean, now they mostly live in Israel. Not too many Jews left in Iraq. But they're actually descended from Jews who stayed after the Babylonian exile ended. But, in theory, look, to this day, in theory, in Orthodox Judaism, sacrifices are merely suspended until the temple can be rebuilt. And one of the first liturgical changes that the conservative movement made was in the Musaf service, where in the Orthodox version of the Siddur, when it talks about the sacrifices, it says, I mean, in both cases, it says to God, please rebuild the temple. And in the Orthodox version, it says where we will offer sacrifices. And in the conservative version, it says,
as you commanded us.
right. In the conservative version, it says where our ancestors offered sacrifices as you commanded. And as to whether, to what extent Orthodox people actually want to rebuild the temple, I don't know. There are certainly a lot of the new ministers in the Israeli government that just took office do want to rebuild the temple and knock down the mosques on the Temple Mount and plow and catapult us into World War III. Because what does it matter? God will protect us. And there were attempts to rebuild the temple. There were attempts to rebuild the temple, sometimes by force, and sometimes there was one Roman emperor named Julian the Apostate. That wasn't his name, but that's the title he became known by. And this was after Constantine and after the Roman Empire was already Christian, and he wanted to revert the empire back to paganism, and he allowed the Jews to start rebuilding the temple. He died before the project was completed, and then when the Christians took over again, that was the end of that. So I think it was a process. But as to why, I think that, by the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, and certainly after that, animal sacrifices didn't carry the resonance that it once did. And so, there was a pragmatic reason that the temple couldn't be rebuilt. But at a certain point, I think people said, oh, maybe this is better. But it's hard to really trace the development of that idea, really. Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, so given that it's Chanukah, and given that I can never remember anything for more than 37 seconds, so there's something weird going on as we speak, which is that all Jews celebrate Hanukkah, but in Israel they have a different story for it than we do. Could you address that and because you've got that down pat and I don't.
Right. Okay. So, there's a concept, I think it was a Had Ha'am who sort of first articulated this concept, the Had Ha'am, the great early Zionist thinker, which he called Shinui Arachim, or transvaluation of values. Okay. And essentially what that means is that we keep doing the same rituals, but we imbue them with new meaning according to our existential needs, all the while insisting that nothing has changed. So that in Israel, Hanukkah is Chag HaMaccabim, right? And because the Maccabees arose and violently kicked out the occupying army and reestablished Jewish independence, right? The same way that they did sought to do under the British Mandate and eventually did in 47, 48, right? And so the Maccabees are a lot more central, I think, to Israeli Judaism than they are to American Judaism. You have, one of the main basketball or sports organizations is called Maccabi. I mean, Maccabi Tel Aviv has won the European Cup a number of times. You have a beer. It's not a very good beer, but it exists, called Maccabi. You have an HMO called Maccabi. I mean, it's really important. Whereas it's not as important in America, right? Whereas for American Jews, so in Israel, it is the fight of Zionism reestablishing Jewish independence. In America, it's the holiday of religious freedom, right? Because that's a core value of American society, particularly for Jews, as it's like one of the things that allows us to exist, and to exist not as a tolerated minority, but to exist as, full and equal participants, right? And so in Israel, I mean, Israelis will tell you that Hanukkah was always about reestablishing Jewish independence. And American Jews fully believe that Hanukkah was always about religious freedom. Although I saw this meme yesterday or today, which said, this a little, somebody in a store said to one of their customers, "Get into the Christmas spirit," and the customer said, "I'm Jewish," and the guy said, "Well, then get into the Hanukkah spirit," and the guy said, "The Hanukkah spirit is the spirit of killing people who try to force us to observe their holidays." But we imbue the holiday with the meaning that we need, right? And the holiday of killing our enemies and killing assimilated Jews, not going to be very successful in America. It's not the holiday that we need, right? And so it's I think entirely natural. I mean, and I would say in that sense, 'twas ever thus. I mean, it is not the case that any ritual had and has had only one meaning, right? I mean, what does matzah stand for? Right? Is it the bread that we ate in Egypt as slaves, or is it the bread that we ate when we left Egypt because we didn't have time to allow the dough to rise? Right? Virtually every ritual that we have has multiple meanings.
Thank you.
Next. Yeah, Toby. Need to unmute.
This is in reference to that Kiddush conversation that we had the past Shabbat.
Yeah.
About one of the points that was discussed in detail was the validity of allowing somebody to commit suicide if they're really extremely ill, or getting a doctor to help them do it. And I had a question that I didn't have the time to ask.
Sure.
I was concerned about, I think Jacob, Michael Shai brought up that particular issue, that the discussion that was focused on did not include the patient's point of view,
Right.
but it was primarily the medical staff, the doctor's point of view. And I was just wondering what's really the Jewish attitude about dealing with a patient whose doctor has been very involved all along and realizes that the misery he's going through isn't going to get any better.
Right.
Is it considered acceptable for that doctor to help them come to the end of their, at that point, really miserable life? Then
Right.
there's, and the doctor, I would, assuming the doctor realizes that there's no hope.
Right. So, I mean, I'm gonna, first of all, quibble with one phrase that you used, and that is the Jewish perspective or the Jewish attitude. Right. I mean, if I've done anything the past 10 and a half years, I've disabused you of the notion that there is one, the Jewish perspective on virtually anything. And I can tell you that the one time I remember very serious conflict within the Washington Board of Rabbis was when some of the Reform and Reconstructionist rabbis brought a speaker from what was then known as the Hemlock Society. It has a different name now, to urge us to support the proposed bill for physician-assisted suicide. And the conservative and Orthodox rabbis were like horrified. Okay, so from my perspective as a conservative rabbi, killing another person is never acceptable. Killing yourself is never acceptable. Having said that, I would say the following. There is a halachic concept known as asur aval patur, which means forbidden but not punished, okay? So that certainly, I mean, obviously, people who commit suicide in other than cases of like terminal illness and extreme pain do it under mental duress that is unbearable, and I understand that. Mark Comrade did talk a little bit about, he didn't use this phrase, but the principle of dual effect. Okay, so first of all, I mean, there is sometimes a misconception that halakha requires us to do everything possible to prolong life, and it does not. It is certainly permissible to forego futile treatments. It is possible, I mean, my mom, when she had brain metastases and, the treatment was horrible. And she said, let's go with palliative care. And my brother and I, from very different perspectives, were both okay with that. And certainly, if somebody is, clearly near death and you put in a DNR, that's fine. You say, stop giving them antibiotics, that's fine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Can you intentionally kill somebody? I don't believe that you can. Let me finish. All right. Can you give them morphine, large doses of morphine, to mitigate their pain, even though they're possible side effect of killing them? Yes. as long as it's not your intention to kill them, right? So that's what we call the principle of dual effect. Having said that, I mean, up until the last 2-3 years, it was the unanimous and uncontroverted position of the conservative rabbinate officially. I'm not saying that there weren't outliers, but the position of the law committee and the position of the overwhelming majority of conservative rabbis is that physician-assisted suicide is never permissible. More recently, Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who's one of our leading medical ethicists, said that there could be acceptable circumstances for physician-assisted suicide if it's really like long-term excruciating pain and you've tried all kinds of palliative care and the palliative care is not relieving the pain, then it could be considered acceptable. I'm not sure I agree with him, but I don't have the learning or the chutzpah to say I think he's wrong either. So I kind of withhold judgment on that. Although, I mean, Michael Shai's point is correct. I mean, we were talking really about the rights and obligations of physicians, not the rights and obligations of patients. And that is absolutely true. And the one thing that I would say is that, clearly, I mean, both American and Jewish law recognize patient autonomy. You have the right to refuse treatment. Now, halachically, in other words, my doctor says to me, have this surgery or you're going to die. And I decide not to have the surgery because I want to die. That's not acceptable. If I decline to have the surgery because the surgery itself will be very painful and maybe not successful, and I want to avoid the pain, I have that right halachically. And certainly, I mean, under American law, I have the right to decline that surgery even because I want to die. Although, I mean, the doctor could certainly put in for a psych consult or whatever. And I've seen this with people who, were very sick and really wanted to die. And the reality is that they were depressed and their depression was not being treated at all. So that is a factor too. Mike, you had your hand up.
I find it interesting that if you say physician-assisted suicide, Mark gets up and he says, "How dare you voice that on us doctors?" But if you say pull the plug, they're comfortable. And you, Rabbi, you draw a distinction between withholding food and water. And so it's okay for somebody to starve to death, but the issue we labeled it physician-assisted suicide, but there's no difference between that and pulling the plug.
No, there's absolutely a difference. If in physician-assisted suicide, it is the barbiturates or whatever medication that's used that causes the death. In pulling the plug, it is the damage to whatever system that causes the death. It's completely different. I mean, it is a natural death versus an artificially.
Right. I agree that that's the case. But so by Jewish law, there is no problem in, as you try to take halacha into the 21st century, there is no problem in turning off the device that is keeping a person alive as opposed to giving them a pill.
That not necessarily so. Okay, I mean, I have to tell you that, look, any attempt to poskin halacha depends on two things. It depends on the law and it depends on the facts, right? And I don't know enough about medicine to be comfortable poskening, right, in things that are medically complicated, right? In other words, generally, when we say you can turn off the respirator and there's no problem, the patient is already brain dead.
Correct. Most of it.
Okay, and halacha accepts brain death as true death. Okay, if the person was not brain dead, could you turn off the respirator? I don't know that you could. Okay, it depends on medical realities that, first of all, we only have a theoretical patient. But beyond that, I mean, I can't, I would have to, I mean, if I was guiding the family as to what's Jewishly ethically appropriate, I would have to ask the doctor, we turn the machine off, what happens? Okay, if we leave it on, what happens? It also, I mean, I went through this with my mom, by the way. I don't know if I ever described this in one of these classes, but my mom had been adamant, way before she took ill, that she did not want a feeding tube. She would rather die than have a feeding tube. Okay, so when she first got sick with thyroid cancer, which was several years before she died, and the treatment, the radiation for thyroid cancer closed up and burnt her esophagus, and she could not swallow. And the doctors said, if we don't give her a feeding tube, she will die because from malnutrition. And my mom said, no feeding tube, no feeding tube, no feeding tube, no feeding tube. And I had a discussion with the doctor outside of my mom's presence. I said, it's her decision. But I want to make sure I understand. You're telling me that if she does not get the feeding tube, she will die. If she gets the feeding tube, she will need it for several weeks while her esophagus recovers, and then she will be able to eat and drink again. Right? You're not telling me that the feeding tube is going to be forever. And the doctor said, no, that's exactly what I'm telling you. I said, let me talk to my mom. I was able to explain that to her. I said, it's still your decision, but this is the thing. I understand that you don't want to spend the rest of your life with a feeding tube, but we're talking about 6 or 8 weeks, and then you'll be able to eat and drink again, and, quite possibly enjoy several more years of life. And, oh, I didn't understand that. Okay, put it in. And she did, and she gained another 5-6 years.
Wow.
Okay, so what I'm saying is that these things depend on medical realia. And I mean, to really be a competent medical ethicist, you have to be both a rabbi and a physician. I mean, of whom there are such people. I ain't one of them.
Can I have the next question?
Yeah, please, Joe.
Yeah, I think, I know I have, and I think others on this call probably have heard you say in the past that you thought the biggest threat to Jewish continuity and thriving in the US was assimilation and not anti-Semitism. But
Right.
given the rise in anti-Semitism, number of incidents in the last few years, do you still feel that way?
That's a fair question. I mean, I think that I still do. Because look, I don't want to minimize the seriousness, okay? But graffiti on bridges and graffiti on schools and even graffiti on shuls is not the same thing as violent attacks, right? I mean, the violent attacks have been obviously Pittsburgh and the grocery store in Jersey City, and the Chabad and Poway. I mean, there have certainly been more violent attacks in the last few years than prior to that. But the difference still is that, when there was violence against Jews in Tsarist Russia or Nazi Germany or whatever, who did you call for help? No one, right? I mean, the authorities were on the side of the pogromists. The authorities were Nazis, right? I mean, nobody was giving very small synagogues $100,000 security grant in Tsarist Russia. So I still think that the bigger threat is assimilation. Having said that, to a certain extent, they go hand in hand. I mean, when people opt out of Jewish life because they're scared. We still hear stories of people who discover that their grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and they never knew that they were Jewish or whatever. And I can understand that. I mean, anti-Semitism can certainly drive people away from the practice of Judaism. But I still maintain that anti-Semitism is not as great a threat as assimilation. I mean, I could be wrong. Obviously, I hope I'm not, but I think, we have, not every anti-Semitic incident is the same, right? I mean, there's a big difference between graffiti on a school and, somebody coming in with semi-automatic rifles killing 8 people.
Rabbi, could you just define the assimilation that you see so threatening?
By assimilation, I mean people who drop out of Jewish life.
Ah,
Okay. It is hard to define that, okay? Because, many Orthodox folks would say that we're assimilated.
exactly. I think we would say we're assimilated.
No, there's a difference between assimilation and acculturation. At least as I use the term, okay? We're certainly acculturated. But by assimilation, I mean dropping out of Jewish life entirely.
Ah, all right.
Or having kids and not giving them the tools or the desire or the ability to participate in Jewish life. And, we see that. I mean, certainly, look, there are plenty of people walking around whose Jewish practice is not what I would wish, but they're still part of the Jewish enterprise and the Jewish collectivity.
And it's always been that way, going back to biblical times,
Right.
that a good share of the populace was not focused totally on the knowledge that it would take to be an observant Jew.
Right. But, I mean, it's like, I mean, and it's not a binary, right? I mean, but the question is, I mean, if I look, for example, at my brother, okay, he's a Unitarian. His ex-wife is Catholic. His two daughters are not halakhically Jewish. I don't think they consider themselves Jewish. They never went to Hillel or anything like that. Okay. But at the same time, so my brother is part of a group within his Unitarian congregation called Unitarians for Jewish Awareness. It's basically the Jewish club within the larger Unitarian congregation, right? And we had a discussion because by him, my dad's yahrzeit is November 7th. And by me, it's whatever date it falls according to the Hebrew calendar, right? So my brother this year lit 2 yahrzeit candles, one on each date. Okay. Is he I don't know. I mean, he certainly, he probably is what Arthur Fiedler called a terminal Jew. That is to say, right, the last Jew in that line. But maybe not. I mean, is it impossible that one day one of his girls will say, hey, I'd like to explore this Jewish stuff a little bit more, and either decide that she's Jewish, even though halakhically she's not, or maybe even, who knows, right? So it's not a binary. I mean, that's one of the problems that, when Israelis talk about all the Jews in the United States who are assimilated, it's like it's a binary, right? I can define assimilated or not assimilated. It's a spectrum. But I think that, the likelihood of my brother contributing to the ongoing enterprise of the Jewish people is slim. Right? I mean, on the other hand, I never had kids either. So, but I had a lot of students who became rabbis, most of whom do have kids, so it's not, like I said, it's not a binary. It's not easy to define.
Good.
Right. Anybody else? All right, Marilyn. Yeah.
Yeah, not a close friend, but an acquaintance who was Ukrainian, emigrated to this country years ago, he was Jewish, married a Jewish woman here. The daughter is Jewish. He says he hates Ukrainians, that all anti-Semites. Yet we see the president is identified as Jewish. What is the story there?
Look, I mean, historically, I mean, anti-Semitism in Ukraine was very high, right? But on the other hand, they elected a Jew, right? I mean, that's just a fact. I mean, we haven't yet elected a Jew. I mean,
No.
you know, um, I was a candidate, interestingly enough, here in Maryland. I was a delegate candidate for Joe Lieberman for president in 2004, but he didn't make it as far as even the primary. But I mean, it's really interesting because I had this exact conversation only about polls, okay? When the Russians were cracking down on Valenza and Solidarity and all of that, and I said to my mentor, Father Walsh, the Polish deserve it because they're all anti-Semites and they're all complicit in the Holocaust. And it was only later that I learned about Jan Karski, who I gave that sermon about on the High Holidays a few years ago. And, the Pope, I mean, that is to say the then Pope, John Paul II, who had many Jewish friends and was in the Polish so it's not, I mean, I don't think that you can say that they are all, right? And saying they are all about Ukrainians or Poles is just the same as saying they are all about Jews. Okay. And we know that ain't so. Well, no matter what it is, right? No matter what it is. I mean, there's 8 of us on this conversation, and I am sure that, and we all know that we are extremely diverse, right? I mean, one of my intellectual mentors, right? Rabbi David Novak said to me one time, he said, yes, I mean, this is the typical Jewish attitude, right? There's 14 million Jews in the world, and we are incredibly diverse. And there's 5 billion Goyim, and they're all the same. Right? But, I would say that, yeah, I think for a lot of Jews, there's a certain emotional difficulty in supporting Ukraine, knowing the history, right? I mean, for me, my ancestors, I don't have Ukrainian Jewish ancestry. It's Polish and Lithuanian, right? Although I subsequently learned that the Lithuania, like the part of Lithuania that they came from, is now part of Belarus. I mean, these borders don't really mean anything. But yeah, I mean, it is emotionally difficult, but I mean, people change and nations change. I mean, for me, to this day, I won't visit Germany, but I think, I'm probably in a minority at this point.
No.
No.
We went once and Bobby was remarkably uncomfortable there especially every time she saw an older guy.
Right.
And all she could think is, and where were you?
Right.
But when we lived in Japan, the Japanese had a totally different attitude. It was their fault, and they caused, you resulted. It wasn't your hands were not dirty, ours were. That's how they viewed it. I mean, but my grandmother was from Ukraine, from a town that has been in the papers called Zhytomyr.
Uh-huh.
And if things were hunky-dory there, she wouldn't have left. I mean,
Right.
It's not just like here that somebody painted something someplace. Life was made sufficiently uncomfortable that people took whatever they could fit in a suitcase and left. And I'm nevertheless, I don't see that that Ukraine should, that I don't see that Russia has the right. I don't think it's a healthy thing globally or in our interest for any country to do that to any country. And the idea that one guy can cause all this grief, I mean, I don't know what we should do about it. So far, we don't know either. And the Ukrainians, I mean, they're standing up. That was one of the most amazing things when you look for the man of the year or the person of the year in
Right.
Time magazine. It's just the Ukrainians standing up to not let this go any further, regardless of the cost. It's hard to say, yeah, but you weren't nice to my bubby.
Right. No, look, there is, to my mind, and I say this, not as a rabbi, but simply as an American, there is no doubt in my mind that the fight for democracy is indivisible. And I would say that it is no accident that the handful of people in Congress who are pro-Putin are also pro-January 6th. Right? I mean, and they don't support democracy there, and they don't support democracy here. They support white Christian authoritarianism, and the fight for democracy and the fight for pluralistic, small L liberal democracy is indivisible. And I mean, there was a time when that was self-evident, especially to conservatives, or people who call themselves conservative. Not so self-evident anymore. So, on that cheerful note. All right. Happy Hanukkah.
So much.
All right. Remember, so Shabbos morning on Zoom only because of anticipated yucky weather.
And,
Thank you, Rabbi.
That's the official term.
Yeah.
and
All right.
you
See
know,
y'all.
you can
Good
still
night.
sign up for the Sisterhood Hanukkah party.
Okay.
Let Charlotte know.